Well, good evening, you beautiful New Zealanders. When I saw this document that came out a few days ago about the 440 church ministers who wrote a letter to all the parliamentarians to tell them how bad David Seymour's treaty principles bill was, I just couldn't resist replying to this. And so I have actually written a reply to these 440 church ministers. And here is the document here. It says in this document, what 400 church leaders wrote is bounded by a rectangle. Just so I'm letting you know how this is going to work. So when you read this document, and I'll put this document in the description of this video so you can download it yourself, but anything that the church leaders write is in a black box. Everything else is a response to what the church leaders said. Now this document contains hyperlinks. To access the hyperlinks, you have to read it online, an online copy, so you can just scan this QR code here and that takes you to an online copy. I recommend you begin by downloading the final English draft of the treaty. This was the document used to create the treaty in Maori. So if you want to know what the treaty in Maori says, this is the document to read. So just click there and download it. I urge you to read this document a few times. It's not very long. It's only, a few minutes reading, two or 3 minutes reading each time, so you can thoroughly digest its content and meaning. So here is the actual letter from the church minister. Starts off with, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Now that's from Matthew 5:19. So what are we to make of that verse being used here? Well, here we go. The Christian leaders are using this verse out of context. Think about it. It was Jesus who said Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Yet in John 2:14-16, you can look this up in your Bible yourself, the same Jesus created chaos in the temple by making a whip. Whip in hand, he tipped over the tables of the money changers, drove them all out of the temple. Jesus literally created chaos in the temple by going to war with those peddling fraud and corruption. So Jesus was hardly a peacemaker. In fact, he went to war with those people in the temple. So is Jesus being hypocritical by saying one thing, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and on another occasion doing another, cleansing the temple? No, Jesus is not being hypocritical. So how do we reconcile the two? When Jesus is talking about peacemakers, he's talking about people who work to reconcile people with God. What does this mean? Without going into too much detail, the Bible teaches that all people, because of their sin, are disconnected from God or out of relationship with Him. They can be connected with God and in relationship with Him, but only by turning from their sin, asking Jesus for forgiveness. This is what the Bible teaches. Christians call this being reconciled to God. Christians who seek to reconcile people to God are called peacemakers. Now you'll remember Billy Graham, the famous American evangelist. Well, Billy Graham was like that. He was somebody who was a peacemaker, reconciling people to God. Clearly, obviously, David Seymour's bill has absolutely nothing to do with New Zealanders being reconciled to God, and David is not trying to reconcile New Zealanders to God. So why did the Christian leaders use this verse? It's obvious. They were trying to say, quote, David, through his bill, is creating racial division. He should be trying to create peace between Maori and the rest of New Zealand. The best way to do that, said these Christian leaders, is to drop the bill. Well, in my view, there are only two routes to peace in New Zealand. First, we all have to become Maori and join in with the coup, because that's what's happening right now. There is a coup going on driven by Maori activists. And if we all did that, all become Maori, this would achieve a false peace, which is not really peace at all. And there's a good verse to look at in Jeremiah 6:14, which says, "Peace, peace, and there is no peace." Because all of us who become Maori would be knowing what the truth is, that we're being shafted and we've only become Maori just to make peace. But in our hearts, we know that what we're doing is wrong. The second thing that we can do to create peace is rip the lid off all the fraud and corruption, confront it, fully restore democracy, and commit to honouring the treaty as it was understood by all parties in 1840. This will achieve real and lasting peace, because of those two options, only one of those is the right option, and that's the second one. So New Zealanders are going to have to choose, because it's one or the other. We can't have both. And right now we're on a collision course between those two routes. Okay, back to the Bible verse. Shame on these church leaders for using a verse out of context and using it for political purposes. A double condemnation. Jesus would not approve of this. This is the kind of behavior characteristic of Jesus' arch enemies in the Bible, the scribes and the Pharisees. And there's sort of a picture from a movie of a Pharisee. Jesus calls this group of people scribes and Pharisees. He calls them blind guides, fools, white sepulchres full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness, serpents, vipers, hypocrites. They were the arch enemies of Jesus, and I believe these church leaders have put themselves out there to become classified in the same way. Furthermore, the 400 church leaders make no effort to say precisely where David Seymour's bill breaches the treaty. how it will create division, or how it spreads misinformation. They just say it does. For example, where exactly in what article of the treaty does David's bill breach the treaty? No detail is given by the Christian leaders. Their letter is simply a series of unsubstantiated accusations against the bill and against David Seymour. Again, this kind of behavior is characteristic of scribes and Pharisees in Jesus' day, making accusations without proof to substantiate those accusations. So, is David and his bill creating racial division? Absolutely not. His bill, if successful, will create racial harmony like we haven't seen for 50 years. How so? Well, read this document. There's a document there in the hyperlink. But this is not all. The church leaders use a second verse from the Bible in the same way they use the first, taking it out of context and using it for political purposes. So here's their verse. Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent, the one who does what is righteous, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change his mind. These church leaders are trying to say through this verse from the Bible, an agreement was struck between the Crown and Maori, that is the treaty, and if the Crown wants to be deemed to be righteous, it's blameless and without fault, that's what that word means, they must keep to the agreement and not change their mind. But I would say, hang on a minute, where exactly does David breach the treaty? Where does he break an oath? They're just presuming that he has, without explaining where he has or what he's done. The short answer is that David's bill doesn't breach the treaty at all. Well, how so? Here is David's first principle. The New Zealand government has the right to govern all New Zealanders. You know what? This is a completely accurate summary of Article 1 of the treaty. Maori ceded sovereignty. Maori gave up the right to govern the country. This is what ceding sovereignty means. Here is David's second principle before it was amended in the last day or so. Quote, the New Zealand government will honour all New Zealanders in the chieftainship of their land and all their property. This is exactly what the chiefs agreed to in 1840 via Article 2, Sentence 1, because Article 2's got two sentences of the treaty. Article 2, Sentence 1 says, the Queen confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and the tribes and to all the people of New Zealand the possession of their land, dwellings and all their property. What does this mean? Well, the best way to explain this is like this. Imagine a map of New Zealand, and in the middle of the North Island, draw a red square 1 centimetre by 1 centimetre, like I've just drawn on this map. See the square there in the middle of the North Island? Okay, so just hang on to that. Let's say this square represents the land owned by a particular tribe at the 6th of February 1840. The British considered that everything on that piece of land, dwellings, chattels, rivers, mountains, forests, fisheries, everything was literally owned by that tribe. No problem with that. The British promised to protect that tribe's ownership of everything inside that 1 centimetre square. This is all that Article 2, Sentence 1 promised. Now, here's the thing. Roughly 540 chiefs signed that treaty, so in effect, we could say there are 540 1 centimetre squares all over New Zealand, each square representing the land owned by each tribe. You get it? Not all squares were 1 centimetre. Some were smaller, some larger, depending on the size of the tribe and the size of the land they owned. Now, go back to Article 2, Sentence 1 again and focus on the word property. In the Maori version of the treaty, the word property translates as taonga. In 1840, this word meant property procured by the spear. In other words, tribes went on raids against other tribes pre-1840 and they used spears as weapons as they did so. When they entered a past site of another tribe, they killed and ate the inhabitants or enslaved them and stole their possessions. The possessions were said to be procured by the spear. See, get it? In 1989, the word property in Article 2 was translated by Hugh Carfrew as treasures. This widened the meaning of taonga to mean anything Maori treasure. At this point, treaty fraud really ramped up. By changing the original meaning of this word, Maori started to claim things that were not in their 1 centimetre square in 1840. See? An example would be awarding the 5G cell phone network in New Zealand to Maori because the treaty promised this, and I've given the reference there. Another example would be the claim by Maori that the treaty promised to protect and promote Maori language. Well, how should we view these awards or settlements or treaty claims or promises? Well, in a word, they're outright fraud. There is absolutely nothing in the treaty about the British guaranteeing these things to Maori. So let's go back to the 1 centimetre square, little square in the middle of the North Island analogy. Regarding gifting Maori the 5G network, it's impossible to procure a 5G network with a sphere. For a start, the 5G network did not even exist in 1840. Regarding the treaty promising to protect and promote Maori language, just read the treaty and see if you can see this promise. It's just not there. The British understood that the Maori language, culture, customs were to be preserved and promoted by Maori themselves as they went about their lives inside their 1 centimetre squares. Really, it's a ridiculous idea that one culture, the British, would be made responsible for preserving and promoting the language, culture, and customs of another culture, the Maori. With every other culture, each cultural group is responsible to preserve and promote their own language, culture, and customs. Is that not true? Yes, it is. In short, they delight, that's each culture, they delight to preserve and promote their culture because it's in them to do so. It's part of their very DNA. To put the onus on the government to promote Maori language and culture is just, you know what, it's just a cop-out. Think about it. If Maori language, customs, and culture were really valuable to Maori, wouldn't they want to take responsibility to pay and promote their own culture, customs, and language? So why have they not done this? In New Zealand today, we have 160 cultures. One of those is the Maori culture, 1 out of 160. Maori are the only one of the 160 who demand that the government be responsible for promoting their language, culture, and customs. The other 159 want to fund and promote their own language and culture, but Maori want to be paid to do it. You know what, doesn't that seem odd? There must be other motivations at play here. It does not require much effort to see what they are. Playing the "you promised to promote Maori language, customs, and culture through the treaty" card has proved to be a wonderful cash cow. You know what? It's lucrative. To view just one example of the money going to Maori for the development of their language, custom, and culture, click here. You know, it's a massive racket. Okay, back to the 1 centimetre squares. One of the first tasks the British undertook in the early 1840s was to establish the size and boundaries of each tribe's square. As I have said, some were larger than others depending on the size of the tribe. Once established, titles were issued. The practice of surveying land and issuing title was described by Lord Normanby, Lord Normanby was Hobson's superior in London, as, quote, that system of sale, that is, the British were anticipating buying Maori land, which experience has proved the wisdom and the disregard of which has been so fatal to the prosperity of British settlements. In other words, he said, when you get there, Hobson, you start surveying the land and issuing titles, because we know that system works. We've tried it in Britain. In New Zealand, today, 2024, the British system of surveying the land and issuing titles has been preserved. Every property in New Zealand today has to be surveyed, boundaries established, and a title issued. So, here is my chief point for the first part of this video. For over 50 years or so, from 1974 onwards, activists have been slowly moving the goalposts. The British only ever intended, and the treaty only ever mandated, to protect the possession, ownership of Maori land, dwellings, and property inside their 1 centimetre squares. You get that? The activists now say the British promised via the treaty to protect the Maori ownership or possession of all the natural resources of all New Zealand forever. This is a gross and fraudulent misinterpretation of what the treaty promised. It's a clear breach of the treaty. It's akin to a magician's trick. Put a rose in a black bag and pull out a rabbit. That's what they have done. See? Okay, just for a moment, I want to flick to a PowerPoint present to make sure we've got this absolutely clear. And because we have to understand this so you get a handle on what the heck is going on. There is the little 1 centimetre square inside the North Island. That represents one tribe's land. And remember, everything on that land and inside that square, the British said, that belongs to Maori. They had possession of it. They had ownership of it. That was fine. So we could say that what the British promised each tribe in 1840 was the possession or the ownership of everything inside their 1 centimetre square. That is all. But what's happened over 50 years, as this has been twisted and contorted, they're now saying that the British, through the treaty, promised Maori possession or ownership of everything in New Zealand, all the natural resources over the whole country. See? Maori activists say in 2024 the treaty guarantees us our rangatiratanga over our land. What they mean is the whole of New Zealand. Now they use words like tino rangatiratanga and taonga, and what that does is that confuses everybody, and everybody just says, oh, this is too hard for us, we have no idea what they're talking about. But that is what they are talking about. Rangatiratanga relates to how much land the treaty guaranteed Maori, and it's moved from the 1 centimetre centimetre square to the whole of the country. That's the problem. So can you see how things have been fraudulently twisted and expanded over 50 years? What is interesting and crucial to understand also is that Maori went on to sell 92% of their land. Think about that. So that their claim to the whole of New Zealand is completely without foundation. If you sell your land, you've lost it. Now they want it all back, and they're using the tactic of twisting the treaty to try and get it back. And they're flooding their pleas with Maori language so we don't understand what's going on. They are simply suffering from seller's remorse. That's what's happening. This is why we urgently need a referendum on the treaty. You know that? The fraud and corruption must be brought to an end. This has been going on for 50 years. 400 church leaders are joining in with the activists. Can you believe it? Shame on them. You know what? So what does all this have to do with 400 church leaders and their letter? The answer is that either through ignorance of the facts or willfully, these 400 church leaders are not just participating in this fraud, but they are perpetuating it. Can you believe it? I'll put this document that I'm reading from in the description. You can download it, and if you read the QR code, you'll be able to get all the hyperlinks. So I just hope you do this, because this is going to unlock what these church ministers are really up to. All right, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please keep getting the cards out. We have over 120,000 out at this present stage, and I've lost count of the number of people who are out delivering those cards, and you're doing a fantastic job. So keep it going, because we have to make sure that we crack this. Okay, there's one last thing that I really would love you to do. And what's that? Please download this letter to church leaders. Get some printed at your local copy centre, as many as you like. Obtain the snail mail addresses of the church leaders in your area. You'll be able to obtain these easily by going and doing a Google search, and post them a hard copy. Or find their email addresses and email them a copy. Or, this is probably my favourite, have your local copy centre print out 20 or so copies, or as many as you like. Put these copies in envelopes. Put the envelopes on the windows of cars outside church services on Sunday. Job done. If you're able to do that, that would be absolutely phenomenal. I think that if you put it on church windows is probably the best, the car windows. These leaders need to be challenged. All right, I'll see you tomorrow with the next installment of this video.